In a previous video, I talked about how close Iran and the US were to open conflict. And since then, things seem to have escalated. In the last couple of days, we've seen the US deploying an additional carrier strike group and also quite a lot of additional aircraft to the region. And those join the forces already on station. And the message here is pretty clear. And that's if diplomacy fails, a military option is not just on the table, it's being actively prepared for. So in this video, I want to walk through what a conflict could actually look like if the US and Israel decide to strike Iran. And you know, this is something that's not just in the distant future, but quite possibly in the very near term. So we may see it within the next week or two. So I'll break it down into three phases, and there would be, first would be the strike itself, which would happen, day one, day two. Within the first week, we'd see Iran hitting back. And then within about 2 weeks, 4 weeks, we'd see the proxy forces, which are heavily reliant on Iranian backing, would start launching their own strikes. And obviously this isn't a script that's going to follow neatly, but it's a structure to see, you know, how might this unfold, or how is this most likely going to unfold. So I'll start with the strike itself, and obviously by the time the first missiles are launched, the political decision would have already been made. The talks over Iran's nuclear program have broken down again. Tehran refuses deeper limits on its enrichment or its missile program. The US would then be arguing that Iran is edging too close to nuclear weapons capability, and Israel simply has been saying all along that any deal that simply pauses enrichment but leaves the core infrastructure intact is unacceptable to them. So at this point, the military plan that has been quietly built up over weeks is activated. The first wave of strikes would focus on three broad target sets. And the first would be the nuclear infrastructure. So sites like Natanz, Fordow, Isfahan, and the newer fortified facilities that have been buried under layers of concrete and earth, obviously after previous Israeli attacks. So these are at the heart of Iran's enrichment program. Then we'd see missile and drone bases, which are the locations where Iran uses to launch their ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and long-range drones. These are the systems that give Iran its reach into Israel, into the Gulf, and into US regional bases. And then you'd see air defenses and command and control nodes. So that is radar, surface-to-air missiles, the Republican Guard control and command and control centers that are used to coordinate Iran's response. So neutralizing these early on makes follow-on and subsequent strikes easier and safer. So the US would likely lead with cruise missiles from submarines and destroyers, plus obviously long-range bombers that are operating from outside the region. And then you'd see carrier-based aircraft forward deployed at regional bases would follow. Israel would obviously join in with its own air and missile strikes using experience gained from repeated covert and overt operations against Iranian targets. And in the first 24 hours, you'd likely see dramatic news footage on both sides. So you'd see Iranian state media broadcasting air defense launches and firing night skies. You'd see buildings on fire, certain areas of towns burning. US and Israeli officials would insist that this is a limited and defensive preemptive operation aimed at infrastructure and not a war on the Iranian people. Russia and China would call for an emergency UN meeting and condemnation about the strikes, and a warning obviously about a wider war or a broader war. But this is only day one, the opening act. So within the first week, we'd see Iran hitting back, because ultimately they cannot simply absorb this kind of attack and try to shrug it off. You know, they lose legitimacy as a regime. So within days and possibly within hours, you'd expect direct retaliation, and that would be the first missile strikes on US bases in the region, in Iraq, in eastern Syria, and potentially against facilities in Gulf states that allowed their territory to be used for the first strikes against Iran. And these strikes would be calibrated, so they would be big enough to show that Iran can inflict pain, but purposefully designed to avoid mass American casualties that would then elicit a larger response from the US and would ultimately trigger a full-scale regime change war. Then you'd see missile and drones launched towards Israel. And obviously Iran has developed an extensive arsenal of medium-range systems. Iran does have a very layered air defense system. So you've got Iron Dome, you've got David's Sling, Arrow, and a lot of those systems would intercept many of those missiles and drones coming into Israel, but obviously some of them would get through, and you'd see Israeli bases or infrastructure being damaged, and that would obviously send a signal that Iran is not just going to take this lying down. And at the same time, Iran would close the door on nuclear diplomacy, so you'd see the inspectors being expelled or heavily restricted. Any remaining limits on enrichment would be dropped. The leadership would tell its own population and the region, we tried negotiations, they chose bombs, now we will do whatever we need to survive and to defend ourselves. So obviously this puts the Americans and the Israelis from an optic point of view on the back foot. Then obviously there is the economic pressure valve, which is the Gulf. Iran doesn't have to formally close the Straits of Hormuz to rattle global markets, so harassing tankers boarding or temporarily seizing a high-profile vessel, running exercises that close off parts of the sea, all of these can have a serious effect on oil prices and put a lot of pressure on the US from nervous allies and from financial markets. By the end of week one, you'd likely have US and Israeli forces still striking selected targets, Iran demonstrating that it could hit back directly, and a nervous world watching oil prices, shipping lanes, and escalation. But the conflict wouldn't stay confined to Iran's borders for long. So, within the first couple of weeks, maybe first 2-3 weeks, you'd start to see the activation of proxy forces in the region. And this is where Iran's strategic depth really lies, is that it controls a lot of militias and foreign fighters in that they've built up over years in the region, and this is often referred to as axis of resistance. So these proxy forces would start to light up. In the northern front, you'd see Hezbollah would fire, certainly increase their rocket and missile fire into northern Israel. And this wouldn't be on the same level as the 2006 war, because their infrastructure has been degraded significantly since then, and Lebanon is on the brink economically. But certainly it's enough to force Israel to fight on two fronts, in the north obviously and in the east against Iran. Israel would respond with airstrikes and artillery in Lebanon, which would ultimately also risk a wider destabilization there. And in the east, you'd see Iraqi and Syrian aligned militias, or Iranian aligned militias in those areas, would escalate their drone and rocket attacks on US bases, logistics hubs, and diplomatic facilities. And the goal would be to make the American presence politically and physically unsustainable, and to turn any campaign against Iran into a messy, multi-country insurgency conflict. And then in the south, the Houthis in Yemen would likely intensify attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea and Bab el-Mandab, I always get that wrong, routes that are previously under pressure from previous crises. And the US and its partners would respond with naval escorts and airstrikes on launch sites, further militarizing yet another corridor of global trade. You'd also see an invisible front, and that's cyber attacks on Israeli and Western infrastructure, and plausible deniable operations targeting what Iran sees as American and Israeli interests. So by the end of the first month, the picture would look like something like this. You'd see Iran's nuclear and military facilities would be damaged but not erased. The US and Israel are entangled in a region-wide conflict stretching from Lebanon to Iraq, Yemen, and the Red Sea. Global markets would be jittery, shipping routes would be under threat, and every regional actor would be scrambling to contain the fallout. Now, these strikes themselves may only last a couple of days. The retaliation phase might last weeks, but the consequences for energy markets and regional alliances would echo for quite a lot longer than that. And that's why the standoff over Iran isn't just another Middle East flare-up. It's a test of what great power coercion looks like in the world. where everybody is trying to avoid a big war, but nobody wants to look weak. And that's the problem. Neither side is willing to back down.